Okay, it is 8 p.m. and we're going to do a little landscape drawing as promised. So let's get going. I am a recent convert to doing digital sketching, and I find it highly convenient for explaining things and doing lots of versions and all of that. So, um, at times I definitely mess up and make mistakes. So, if I do, please forgive me. Um, let's talk about landscape in terms of composition, because when you create a landscape, you're trying to create depth in a very direct way. And if you don't get depth in a landscape, you're kind of in trouble. And so I'm going to use this guy as reference. This guy Noah Bradley provides a lot of resources that you should definitely check out. One of the things you'll notice about successful landscapes is they all have a horizon line in a limited number of places. It can be at the 1/3 line. Rarely will it be at 1/2, kind of a specialty thing. It could be at the 2/3 line. It could be at the like 40% line, the 60% line. It could be at the 10% line, which is very rare, or it could be at the 20% line. So here we're going to use just a standard 1/3 line, and that kind of corresponds to what we see in the image. The nice thing about this image is that it has a nice dark big triangle over here on the right. And as we sketch that in, it's going to cross the horizon and come down. The bottom of this triangle is going to eventually become our river. And one of the things we need to be careful of is how this triangle intersects with the corner. We don't want this triangle to come down to this corner at all. That would be bad. So we want to bring it either here or we want to bring it here. We'll stick to what's in the photograph and kind of bring it up on top. Let's see. One of the things about landscape too is that if you can't really draw that well, you can still work with basic shapes. So we'll build this one up with very simple basic blocky shapes, and we'll modify it to make it more interesting as we go along. So to get the river, essentially all that is just another triangle, right? And that triangle's bending and then going this way and hiding behind this larger triangle right here. Okay? Then over here on the left side, we have just a little bit of jump to get you into the land over here. Then in the middle ground, you have a very large tree kind of covering up this transition. When you're composing, I would recommend taking trees and sort of regularizing them to basic shapes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. In the far background, you have another triangle coming out about here and going up and cutting out, coming back, and continuing on up. Then you have several more trees which crop up out here. And even go up and off the page. Way back in the background you have more mountains and so on. So essentially what we've done is with about 4 or 5 triangles and a horizon line, we've created depth, and that's kind of the minimum thing that it takes to do a landscape. Now, landscapes can get into much more depth than that, and there's some things that you are going to want to be able to do. You're going to want to be able to draw trees fluidly. So what we need to do, let me click through a few of these and find a good tree reference. Chosen a bunch of references here, and very few of them seem to have trees. This one has a few. Trees you want to treat as very basic shapes, right? In the beginning, you can treat trees very, very simply, more or less as lollipop trees, and that's fine. trees have a tendency to grow, generally speaking, in one of these shapes. Now, you can take it to a more sophisticated level, and you can take this simple tree, and just by offsetting the trunk slightly to one side, you create a more interesting tree. So just by doing that, you've created a more interesting layout for your tree. Now we can take that another level of sophistication. If we angle the trunk, still keeping our basic tree shape the same, things start to get much more interesting. We now have tree shapes that are useful and are great in composition. So what we can do with this simple tree shape right here, this little triangle shape, we can bring that over if we're talking about a composition like this landscape here, right? We can say, well, we've got our main division of space up here. Got our rocks. All right, and our rocks go out here. We've got our path that kind of comes down, winds around, snakes down. We have the sort of platform that we're standing on that cuts all that off. We'll bring that out above the path. Make our eraser a little smaller. Clean that up a little bit. And then what we can do in order to lay out these trees, we can start to just sketch out basic tree shapes. And since they're on this hill, we can use the bottom to describe the hill. We can start placing and grouping trees all over the place in here. And we can use these simple basic tree shapes everywhere to help us indicate this depth and this form. And we can also use them to kind of walk up the hill. Now, if you were a Photoshop ninja, what you would do is you would take one or two or three trees, lasso them, copy them, and paste them all over the place. Up here at the top, you can do much the same thing, right? You can just take these trees, start grouping them together. You can start doing a whole big group of trees with like little mini peaks and not even really drawing anything in between them. You can throw in a few of these little semi-sophisticated lollipop trees here and there to start to break things up. And very quickly, with just a few trees, you've got yourself a landscape that's filled out. And this stage is really important because this is kind of determining how the rest of the thing is going to go. If at this early stage your landscape isn't working, then it's not going to work as you do more to it. Now, getting back to our original tree shapes, let's say we see this pine tree and we want to get more accurate to it. We can start with our basic triangle. We can run a trunk all the way up through it if we want, that's fine. We can kind of arc it as necessary to any one of these particular trees. And then what we can do is start cutting into the tree to kind of make it a more interesting shape. But I mean, we kind of want to stick to the main tree shape that we have, regularize it a little bit. If we go too far towards the accuracy of the tree, we're just copying out the tree, and then that's not going to be really useful in sketching, right? And it's not going to be as clear. So in the end, our tree shape can be slightly different. And if we take a little bit of green, to kind of highlight this, we're really getting there. I put so much emphasis on this sort of like early layout stage because it's really important. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking basic shapes and then we're just tailoring them to our needs as necessary. If we're drawing, say, an oak tree, we can take this basic oak tree shape, more or less like a little bloop with the sides kind of cut off on the corners. And this is great for middle and far distance trees, by the way. Up close you can do more with trees. But what we can do is we can start to cut into this shape. And we can hit this outer contour shape, go a little above it if we need to. But overall, the goal is to kind of stick to this main tree shape. We can get a branch hanging down here or there, right? But for the most part, we stick to our basic tree shape. And we can get a pretty reasonable oak tree pretty quickly. I've done a little blend mode thing with this. The more times I layer over it, the more it adds value to it. Didn't necessarily mean to do this, but we're going to have to run with it. This is when your brush setting is in the multiply blend mode. Anyway, so there we have a reasonable oak tree done by basically starting with our basic shape and then cutting out of it. And that's going to work really well for composition and sort of getting into the middle stages of what's going on with this. As we advance, then it becomes about style, rendering, and so on. There's some tips and tricks you can do to kind of make things more interesting. Whenever you have a pathway, that's a godsend to the depth in your landscape. So when you have this path, it's a great opportunity because it allows you to send a lot of depth back with a lot of effectiveness and not a lot of effort. So we're going to go up and we're going to sketch out our main triangle here. This is going to have several bands of vegetation and so on. There's another triangle kind of coming in behind it. There's one over here coming out. There's one kind of subdividing down here. Then back here we've got more mountains going back further in space. Remember, in these early stages, we just want to keep it simple. And put a bunch of things back there. So now we're finding our kind of binding box for a composition out here. I think it's fine to work on landscapes without a binding box in the beginning, but eventually you kind of have to be thinking about composition, so you have to put a binding box somewhere to help you along. Now, in this photo we've got a path, and the way that these triangles intersect has kind of indicated a path. The path is just going to snake down right here. This path could be any size. Here it's pretty big. So what we can do with this path to make it a more sophisticated path than what we have laid out here is we can give this path a side. If you've drawn a bunch of ribbon forms, this is going to be really easy for you. So essentially what we're doing is we're giving this some depth with the ribbon form. Come over here and explain the ribbon form. The ribbon is essentially an advanced arc plane. And what you can do with it is you can turn it any of several directions and make it do things for you and turn and go back in space. So this ribbon could be done to create all kinds of things. You could create pathways, like you could use this to create a snake even, potentially. If you want it to be a snake, you start connecting the dots, and you could add, diamondy snake patterning textures to it, and so on. If you wanted your ribbon to be grass, you could lay out a ribbony plane, give that ribbon depth, and then you could arrange grasses onto that ribbon. And so on. So this could be your grass plane. And that's kind of how we're using the ribbon here, except here it's going to be this pathway. Inside the pathway, we want to kind of do a little bit of a linear perspective thing and include some divisions of space, almost like we're drawing a sidewalk, that indicate depth and change. So we're going to give it a little bit of an arc so that it looks like a pathway that's been like worn and trodden down, that a bunch of traffic's gone on it, and that it's at an angle. And doing it at this slight angle helps us create more interest in our drawing, and I think that's really important. You can use this to kind of guide our expectations about what this pathway might be. So then we can use like little rocks and stuff piled up to indicate some of our pathway. And you can see in the reference photo that there's a bunch of rocks all over the place. And we can place rocks in the middle of our pathway. We can place rocks out here. We can put, little groupings of rocks. And the more we do this kind of thing, the easier it is going to be to read what's going on. So this is a little trick. It's sometimes called the rock walking over the hill, rock walking through the water, whatever. It allows you to help indicate what this path is doing and what overlapping planes are doing. We can do that again with trees. We can put our triangular trees down here. We can make them go back in space, put them here, overlapping, and then we can put a few trees behind the ridge back here, right? To help indicate that these trees are going back in space. You can run some trees up the side of the hill, even though this hill in the reference photo is kind of totally rocky. We don't have to stick to it. And these are things that just help us lay out this whole landscape. So there we have, this is a lot of just sort of basic sketching things. But let's back up and talk about what makes all of this stuff work. And the main thing that makes it work is the idea of a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And this is your classic picture of Yosemite Valley, and it'll be a great one to illustrate that. Essentially what you're doing is creating overlapping planes. And here it's very clear what the foreground is. So if this is our binding box that we're working in, then our foreground is right here. This huge triangle, all of the stuff that comes down here, all of the trees that go up here. And our foreground kind of ends where the right side of the valley begins. Our middle ground right here is where L cap is. Right? This is all kind of in the middle of the composition. And middle ground is variable, of course. You know, the middle ground could be much closer to us. But in this situation, our middle ground is kind of far away. And then in our background here, we've got this ridge. We've got Half Dome back here. And that's our far background, way back here, behind Half Dome. And we've got a bunch of clouds up here. So the way this works is we can begin to sort of divide up these planes, and I like to do that with just very basic values and very basic brushes in the composition stage. And I like to do, personally I like to do multiple studies to really understand if my composition is going to work. So generally speaking, if I squint at this, the foreground is all basically dark. So I'm going to go in under here, and you can do this with analog media too, it doesn't matter. I'm going under here with my foreground layer, and I'm going to make my foreground basically dark. These trees more or less appear dark. Because this is kind of classic atmospheric perspective, the middle ground is kind of going to be in the middle. And when you're doing this stage, you can be too careful. You shouldn't be too careful. Should still be loose, be kind of messy, you know, reobserve, check things out, make sure things are going to work for you. Generally speaking too, I would work in multiple layers so I can change things, but don't really need to for our purposes. And here we're going to go a layer lighter as we go back into the background. Then we're going to go very light as we go back one more time. We're going to change this layer blend mode to multiply so that actually shows up. And there we go. We have a little sketch of the valley, and it's very clear that this is how our composition is going to wind up when you break it down like this. The composition is essentially going to get no better than what we've done in the foreground, middle ground, and background. And when you create landscapes or really anything, it's you kind of have to take a harsh look at it that way and decide, well, is this going to be an improvement or is it not? Can I do things with the finishing touches to make it better or not? And it really depends, you know. So we can come back in and we can start sketching in clouds. And we can use clouds to help us along. Clouds can kind of clear up the corners of the composition, help bring us out of the corners. And make things a little more interesting. So there we go. What we can do from here is then we would start making slight changes to the foreground, middle ground, and background. What we can do in the foreground is we can basically take our same brush and add another layer with the same blend mode, multiply blend mode, and start to go on top of it and start to add value differentiation. Even though we're using the same value, the cool thing about the blend mode is that it multiplies it, so it makes it darker, and we can go in and start like patching in big areas of value like we see here as we continue to sketch in like smaller and smaller details. And we can go back into the top layer and sketch out stuff if we want, or not. It doesn't matter. You know, generally speaking, I don't like to put partial trees right up in front. I think that works if you're going to do animations, because you're going to create a lot of stuff where there's a character that's kind of like screened off or something that's looking at everything, and that can kind of change things. And there's a little bit of this dark value down here, kind of crawling up into the middle ground. And as we go into the middle ground, we can continue to make some differentiations. Like we can take the basic shape of L cap here. We can start to break up some of these values. And here what we're looking for is large shapes. What we did in this first layer is we associated two different concepts. We associated big shapes with the foreground and middle ground and background. So what we're doing there is essentially just playing with big, medium, and small, and what's in front, what's in the middle, and what's in the back. So with that very simple concept, we were able to create a semi-realized composition with a little bit of interest very, very quickly. And now what we're doing is we're going in and we're breaking up these big shapes. So now we're getting into medium shapes. So what we're doing is we're taking front, middle, and back, and now we're mixing in light, medium, dark, and big, medium, and small. So as we go back, and back, and back, and back, and back, we're gonna just break down each of these layers more and more and more. So now all these medium shapes are gonna start to bring the composition together just a little bit more. Again, just using very simple, like single value differentiations and everything. Creating a bunch of atmospheric perspective that way. We're gonna have to change the shape of half dome here and make it more dome-ish. There we go. So one of the things you notice is that sometimes you create the same value. So then again, we just keep going. We add another layer and we start differentiating a little bit more. One of the things that we can do is we can then do like a normal blend mode, and we can bring in an increased value range into this sort of thing, and we can test this out. Yeah, so that's going to work really well for these highlight areas on L cap over here. Got these little striations. Got some big areas. So now it's time to work into like smaller shapes, right? Start to really get into this landscape. Just barely see the top here. Up in the foreground, we've got some big areas that are bright. Some textures over here that are bright. One of the things that you'll notice, the rule that I was operating under and that my drawing teacher taught me, is that atmospheric perspective is just about contrast. It's the idea that contrast pops things forward. That's all. It doesn't have to be anything more complicated than that. So you don't have to let it be any more complicated than that. It's already hard enough. There we go. Creating small shapes, breaking these things down. And we can work back down here. There's a light side of this dark shape over here. There's a couple of light pops in here. We may want to go just a hair darker in the background here and just like give us another value to work with for half dome, because it's pretty dark. As we go back in space here. And now we're getting somewhere. We're getting to the point where the valley is just kind of starting to emerge in this interesting way. Then we can go up into the sky and we can say, well, the sky's got a tone on it, so we can decide how bright the sky is going to be. Just come up top, start giving the sky itself a value around the clouds, and then we can work into the clouds, right? So this is going to make the clouds look light, which is what we want. This is also going to further decrease the contrast between background and the mountains themselves, which is also something that we want. We could do this with a smooth gradient tool, but that's kind of fussy and counterintuitive if you're used to painting. We can go a shade darker, and we can start to darken up bits of the clouds where we kind of see what areas of dark or where we need them visually. I think this just becomes about decisions and where you kind of want to put darks and where you need to put darks for the sake of your design. And so now we have a good just basic quick sketch of the valley, and we can again just go back onto our top layer and get our brush tool out, and we can we can fix these little tweaks that we might want to do. Make sure that the half dome gets the right shape down here. So everybody recognizes half dome. We can make some tweaks, the exact shapes of stuff, and we can fuss with it as long as we wanted to. But as far as a quick layout sketch, this shows you the main ideas, which are foreground, middle ground, background, and it shows you big, medium, and small, and it shows you contrast, and specifically contrast ranges, which is really important. So that kind of is the main thing here, and I'll move this reference photo a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. So we have a pretty quick and reasonable sketch here. I'll create let me create a new image here. Okay. And we can keep going with these landscape concepts. So one of the things, if you're just beginning landscape, is and everybody has questions about this, is well, how do I make it easier? What do I do to make it easier? The way to make it easier is by consciously putting your horizon line lower. So let's say we have a landscape that looks like this. If you put your horizon line low, like down here below the 1/3 mark, like we have in this photo, that means that most of the photo or most of the image is going to be above your eye level, because this is your eye level, and whatever is above your eye level is going to be a simple shape, and simple shapes are much easier to deal with than stuff that's below your eye level. When you have stuff that's below your eye level and your horizon's way up here, it then becomes about the ground plane, right? How well can you draw pathways? How well do you know linear perspective? How well can you take a bush, place it onto a perspective grid next to a rock and another bush or whatever? And this gets really complicated really quickly and gets really frustrating. So if you don't want to be frustrated by landscape, I would recommend early on just keeping your horizon line low. And you'll see that immediately. What you're going to do is you're going to take this mountain shape that we have here and knock it out. It's a pretty easy shape to do. It's more or less flat on the bottom, just a slight angle below the horizon line. You can break that shape up really easily. You can kind of tailor it as you see fit. You can take these mountains in the background and kind of blow them up a little bit bigger so that they're creating more interest. You don't have to stick to the reference exactly. you can bring this front mountain down a little bit so that you get a progression of layers in the back that overlap. And then what you can do is you can go on top of that and start just tailoring out these shapes, right? When you start to tailor shapes on top of very basic, simple shapes, then interesting things start to happen because you start to create more variety, more rhythm, and you're going to develop your own style of how to tailor all this stuff too. You know, some people use arcs, some people use straight lines. It really just depends. A lot of people who paint traditionally will use straight lines because it's easy to do that with nice flat brushes. When you actually go to paint something. And what you'll notice about this too is these ideas should translate to any medium. I'm working digitally today because it's quick and easy and I can do a lot of versions really quickly. But that doesn't mean that you have to work in this way. We can take these cloud lines back here that are essentially just simple lines that go almost all the way across the page, with the occasional thing that kind of breaks it up. And there you have it. A simple landscape layout done basically painlessly. Zoom in slightly so we can move around. There we go. Got room for a little more stuff over here, so we'll try to crowd that in. We'll move on to a different image. Let's see here. Okay, this one's kind of cool. This one will help us explain the pathways and how to use rocks and stuff like that. When you're composing and trying to gain depth, what you can do is you can use what you see as a tool to create depth. So I'm going to zoom in kind of far here. And I'm going to create this pathway, kind of according to what I see here. And by pathway, in this case, it's just a river, right? Although it could be a footpath or whatever, it doesn't matter. So compositionally, what we've done is we've created this edge, right? And what we want to do is we want to take this edge and we want to give it a side. So you can see this edge where it cuts out and has all these little bits hanging down and eroding away. And they kind of get bigger as they come towards us. And they exist in little bands. Sometimes there's little bands that help us describe these too, especially in sandstone and limestone. So we've given this a side now, right? And we can imply the side over here as well. We'll even be able to see it in certain places where we kind of turn corners. So there we go. We've got our river and we've got our sides, and it'll turn around and we'll see the side very obviously over here. There we go. Okay, so now we've got a river. So how do we emphasize this? We can use simple and very basic shapes to do that. And when you're doing layouts, bushes and rocks can be done really easily with just this little bloop. So you put ground plane, bloop, ground plane, bloop. And when you repeat these bloops and change the size of them, that can help you do interesting things. For instance, down here, you'll notice that there are bloops of vegetation down here that overlap each other, right? And then there's a bloop of vegetation that crosses over this edge. There are bloops of vegetation that live over here that sit on top. And then there are others that kind of grow down that are growing down by the water side. There's a little one here. There's a big guy over here. And so what these bloops do is they lead you down into the edge, and it's a simple trick. If you have an edge, you have your bloop that's contained by the edge, you have your bloop that breaks the edge, you have your bloop that goes behind the edge. And that, right there, is the rock walking over the hill. So it's a very simple trick, and what it makes you do is it leads you over the hill and implies that the hill continues beyond that line. So if we go down into our first layer and erase some stuff, you can see that start to happen. So we're getting our edges kind of defined here. Then what you can do is you can take the rocks in the water over here. Got a rock in the water. You've got a little ridge of white water area. You've got a big rock in the water over here. Right, another ridge. You've got another rock in the water. Right, that helps you go over here. Then you've got a rock on the water's edge, overlapping the water's edge. Then you've got your rock sitting over the water over here. And here's the water's edge. And so you can make the rock walk over the hill, and you can make it cross the stream. You can, where you get a dead zone and things get a little boring and you need more interest, you can stack a bunch of rocks behind each other. And group them. And you can put trees that go up here and break up that edge. You can have trees that go behind it, sit back here. You can have trees that all group together. And help you break up this not interesting straight edge of the pathway. And so on. So what you're essentially doing with your landscape is you're taking these little shape placeholders and you're making them do things that are very simple and very basic, but yet very useful. And a lot of this just comes back to the idea of overlap. You know, you've seen it 1,000 times. This square is in front of this square is in front of this square. And you have that because you have a full square, you have one where it's interrupted, and you have one where it's not touching. And so they seem like they're further behind each other. And you read them as a square, the ones in the back, even though the shape is really only just this both times. Your eye kind of completes the rest of the rectangle. So that's kind of a fun thing to do with landscape. And what we're doing is we're just maximizing it. We're saying, you know, this is the foreground, this is the middle ground, and this is the background, and we're just breaking up those shapes. So we're just saying, like, here's our format, you know, here's our foreground, right? That's this square. Here's our middle ground. And here's our background, way back here. And that's really all it takes to do an effective landscape, is an understanding of overlap, foreground, and middle ground, and background. And then what we're doing is we're just breaking that down. When we get down to a medium shape or something like a pathway, we're just saying, well, this pathway is, or this ridge is in the middle ground, say, and then what we're going to do is we're going to place a rock in the foreground. We're going to place another one in the middle ground so that it overlaps, and then we're going to place another one in the background so that it overlaps. So again, you have the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. And we're just making use of each of those tricks in multiple small ways. Now it gets a little messy when you get down here because we're working with all of these overlapping shapes and we still have our previous shapes under it. But when you start to clean this up and erase and tweak it, everything becomes much more clear. And when we take and kind of erase some of this line work here, you can kind of see that start to happen. So that's our main landscape concepts. It's pretty simple. And then from there, what you get into doing is changing up the lighting, right? So here in this landscape we did dark, medium, and light as we go back, right? So we did dark foreground, medium, middle ground, light background. But it doesn't have to be that case. There's other ways that you can compose this, right? So let's open a new image. Zoom in again. And we'll explore that. Okay. So let's find a reference image that kind of does something a little different. So this one we have a dark foreground, a light middle ground, and a medium background. This one's kind of cool. So in this one, we're going to do this really quick and really simple. So we're going to simplify this very greatly. Essentially in our foreground, and I just drew on the background. Let me undo that and back up. That's going to mess me up. So we're going to draw on this layer. We'll do our sketch layer. In our foreground, we have our little pathway here. It goes up and all funky. Then over here, we've got our middle ground, where we have this big mountain shape coming down and over here. And then in our background, we've got our mountains over here. So we'll take out some of the complexity here. Okay. So what we're going to do is leave that layer on top. We're going to do a medium foreground. Because overall, if you squint at it, the foreground's pretty medium. It has a fair number of trees and stuff that are relatively dark in it. The background's fairly light, and the middle ground is dark. Okay, I'm going to add a layer. Okay, we're going to do our dark middle ground next. When we work in layers, what's kind of cool is we can be even less careful. And then in the back, we've got our light background. So there you have it. Essentially what we've done is we've created a value pattern. Then from there we can begin differentiating that value and changing things up a little bit more. But at its core, that explains like a very basic lighting situation. And there's only a handful of these lighting situations. So we've already encountered dark to light as you go back. We've got light in the foreground, shadow in the middle ground, light in the background again. Here we've got a relatively dark background, a medium foreground, kind of a light middle ground, or a light light foreground. Um, Here in this reference, we've got just this pop of light in the middle. I've already seen that guy. Here what's kind of cool is we have like extreme light in this background because of the snow. And we've got, you know, a lot of dark in the foreground, and most of it's kind of this middle ground, mid-tone. And what's nice here is we've got all these like cloud shadows in this valley scene. So that gives us a foreground that's kind of medium to medium dark. We've got these light areas here in the middle ground with all these very dark areas in the middle ground as well because of the shadows. And we're constantly playing off that variety as we go through back here in this particular photo. And that's what makes it so engaging to have these cloud shadows that just sort of hit the ground. But again, since we're looking down, we have to be very good, and the horizon's high, we have to be very good at doing like kind of perspective-y stuff. So it could be an interesting one to explore. That kind of wraps up all of the thoughts that I have on landscape in particular. And if there are any questions, feel free to email me at any time. If you want feedback, you can subscribe to the Patreon and use the feedback tier, and I'll give video critique every month for that, for whatever images that you're working on. Space is limited for that, of course. And then if you want to follow me on Instagram, I have a brand new account just for teaching and drawing, and that is @drawwithmead.